Welcome to what is something like the Vienna session of this year's IMHOS. And I'm Markus Lampe from Vienna University of Economics and Business, which is located in Vienna's second district. And 3 metro stops west of here at the University of Vienna, we have Kirsten Wandschneider of the University of Vienna. To make this a little less parochial, she brought co-authors from or located in the Middle East and in California, and a paper on international trade and the dangers of unilateral protectionist initiatives called the Smoot-Hawley Trade War. Before I hand over to Kirsten, the usual rules apply: 40 minutes, then 20 minutes of Q&A, and an informal 15 minutes extension. Please use the Q&A space for questions. I might admit clarification questions if they have the hashtag clarification. Thank you very much. Kirsten, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for including this paper in this series. As Markus already said, this is joint work with Chris Michener and Kevin O'Rourke, and they both may join in. I think Kevin is here and can chime out throughout the discussion. So the topic of the paper is the Smoot-Hawley Trade War. And what provoked us to re-examine Smoot-Hawley was very much the US trade policy under the Trump administration. So former President Trump, as you all might know, held a rather naive idea on trade wars, exemplified by this tweet: when a country, the USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, trade wars are good and easy to win. Example, when we're down 100 billion with a certain country, they get cute, don't trade anymore, we win big, it's easy. So while this, of course, reflects a sort of naive interpretation about winners and losers of trade, it does suggest that trade wars can be an effective policy instrument that can work in favor of the US. And in this context, and in this sort of broader discussion around protective trade policies, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Bill of 1930 has often been cited as a cautionary tale of a trade war. It's been associated with a disastrous decline in trade in the 1930s. It's often seen as a contributor to the severity of the Great Depression. And by some, among them Harold James, it's been sort of coined the end of globalization. That said, economic historians have generally not ascribed a large role to Smoot-Hawley as a contributor to the Great Depression, simply because the size of the output decline at the time leaves little additional room for the effects of trade policy. But that does pose the question to what extent Smoot-Hawley actually triggered a trade war and what the effects were. There are also interesting parallels to the present. So like with this most recent trade war, Smoot-Hawley was initiated by the US. It was provoked by concerns over fairness of trade. It followed a period of sustained economic expansion for the US economy. And we see targeted responses by affected countries, including sort of retaliatory tariffs, boycotts, and other forms of trade policy. So of course, there is a large literature that's been done on Smoot-Hawley. There's also a large literature on the general impact of tariffs and other trade barriers on trade in the 1930s. And for reasons of time, I'll skip the summary here, but it's important to note that to our knowledge, Smoot-Hawley has not been analyzed systematically as a trade war. And this is sort of where we see the contribution of this paper. So we provide an explicit empirical analysis of the trade war from an international perspective. And we sort of ask the question, who retaliated? And then what were the effects of this trade war, both on the provocateurs, so the US, and on the countries that respond, the retaliators. And crucial for our analysis here is the definition of a trade war, and to sort of separate a trade war from a general rise in protectionism at the time. So we rely on Conybeare's definition of the trade war as a category of intense international conflict where states interact, bargain, and retaliate primarily over economic objectives directly related to the traded goods or service sectors of their economies, and where the means used are restrictions on the free flow of goods and services. And what's key here is timely retaliation. So we'll make use of this to identify the participants of the trade war. And then we bring to this new high-frequency data on global bilateral trade flows in the 1920s and 30s. And we use this data set to identify the effects associated with the trade war rather than the sort of general rise in protectionism. We also use product level data on US exports at the quarterly level from 1926 to 1932. And we look for targeting on specific US exports by trade partners. So we look at specific product categories and we signal out for specific products, for example, autos. And then we offer a welfare analysis for all participants to measure the economic costs of the trade war. So just to preview our findings, we find that there is evidence for a trade war, and US exports to countries that explicitly retaliated by raising tariffs declined by 28 to 32% compared with the countries that did not respond. US exports to countries that protested the tariff fell by about 15 to 23%. And there is evidence that these countries might have resorted to non-tariff barriers, such as quotas and boycotts. We also find that retaliators and protesters appear to have been strategic in that they targeted key US exports. So if we look at the top 10 US export categories to the responders, we find that they fell disproportionately by about a quarter. And we find that differentiated consumer goods like American automobiles were singled out and fell by an additional 43%. And in terms of welfare, we find that Smoot-Hawley reduced the welfare from trade by 16% for the retaliating countries through the end of 1931. Just to offer some context, and without going too much into the historical detail, I just want to highlight some key points. So what's important for our empirical approach is that during the negotiations for Smoot-Hawley, the Senate passes a resolution requiring the US State Department to submit all formal complaints of countries protesting the proposed tariff to the US Finance Committee. So in these formal complaints, countries state, and sometimes very explicitly, what their concerns are, which actions they're threatening to use in response, what industries might be affected. US senators tried to dismiss these complaints, tried to dismiss these protests in saying that foreign countries do not have a right to sort of interfere with US trade policy. But we do use these records to identify the set of countries that protest the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Despite these protests, Smoot-Hawley is signed by President Hoover on June 17, 1930, comes into effect the following day. And it was rather far-reaching. So over 3,000 items in the tariff code, close to 900 see increases in tariffs and 230 see decreases. The average tariff rate increases from roughly 35% to 41%, but we see very differential effects on different product categories. So just to illustrate this, there's a cartoon here where you see that Uncle Sam is sort of being bombarded by the protests that are coming over this wall of high tariffs. So countries respond to Smoot-Hawley. They respond by filing these protests, but they also respond by increasing tariffs on US goods. And this is recognized in the contemporary literature. For example, the League of Nations states that the Hawley-Smoot tariff in the United States was a signal for an outburst of tariff-making activity in other countries, partly at least by way of reprisals. Extensive increases in duties were made almost immediately by Canada, Cuba, Mexico, France, Italy, and Spain. So one example, Canada raises duties twice in 1930. We also see parties responding by forming new political parties like the United Empire Party in Great Britain. Overall, we identified 10 countries that retaliate by raising tariffs. And most of those goes back to the contemporary literature, foremost Jones and Mann. And there are over 40 countries that file these formal complaints protesting the tariff with the US State Department. Countries also respond by organizing boycotts. So Switzerland, for example, tries to boycott imports of watches and clocks. Shipbuilders of Hamburg, Germany, they were influential in introducing a proposal to deny registration of American-built automobiles in Germany. Generally, countries sort of complain that the US is already running a large trade surplus, is the world's largest creditor, and had already increased tariffs in the early 1920s. Overall, though, we see, or we classify both the increases in tariffs that we see and also the non-tariff responses as retaliation towards the US, and we do classify this as a trade war. So here in the responses, you see Canada, for example, that plays back the ball in tennis and sort of hits the US on the nose, emphasizing that this was a hurtful process for the US, that there was response that impacted the US. So on this next slide, you see a list of countries that retaliated and that protested the tariff. And retaliators are here really the set of 10 countries that actually raised tariffs in response to Smoot-Hawley. Protesters are the countries that did file the reports with the State Department. As you can see, there's overlap between those two groups. So except for Cuba, actually all the retaliators also filed protests. So what we do in latter parts of the paper is we take out the retaliators from that group of protesters, and we call the group of protesters that then did not follow through with retaliation the threateners, so that the set of retaliators and the set of threateners are sort of non-overlapping sets. And we refer to the joint set of retaliators and protesters as responders. If you take a look at US trade right before the implementation of Smoot-Hawley in 1928, then we can see that the 10 countries that were the top US export destinations all protested or retaliated. And that looking at the top 10 source countries for US imports, 8 out of 10 also protest or retaliate, right? So you can see that this clearly impacted, and we see this reaction among the most important trade partners for the US at the time. So the first question we ask in the paper is, can we sort of predict who protests and who retaliates? And we run a simple probit regression, including covariates that sort of characterize a country's trade position and its trade relationship with the US. And we try to identify which countries are protesting or retaliating. So we use a dependent variable 0,1 if the country imposes a retaliatory tariff or files a formal protest. And we control for a number of independent variables, so share for exports to the US, imports from the US, and we look at other possible confounders like UK empire membership, most favored nation agreement with the US. We look at a country's polity score and the bilateral trade balance with the US and the overall trade balance. Looking at the results here, we find that counter to historical narrative, countries that are running large bilateral trade deficits with the US were actually not more likely to lodge a complaint or to retaliate. So the overall trade balance is actually positively associated with responder status. So it seems to be that countries running larger trade surpluses are actually more likely to respond. What we also find is that democracies are more likely to protest and more likely to retaliate. And we see that a 1 unit increase in the polity score actually raises the probability of protesting by around 14%. And we interpret this as saying that there might have been lobbying within countries that was particularly effective when countries were democracies or had democratically elected officials. We actually see this sort of lobbying for specific industry in these Senate reports, in these complaints that are being filed with the Senate. So we find that there is sort of discussion of specific items like cigars, cigarette holders in Austria. Granted, bread matches in Finland, shoes, Czechoslovakia. So we are finding this, and we find that probably explains this response that we're seeing on the democracies. But the heart of the paper is really this comprehensive analysis of trade wars. And we bring a new quarterly level data set of bilateral trade flows to this question. So we have a data set that consists of 99 countries total, 55 sovereign, roughly spanning 1925 to 1938. And that comprises over 108,000 trade observations. And we compiled this from national level trade statistics. And to bring together the full data set, we sort of follow a standard classification of the colonies, followed on head. We construct a trade flow variable that's based on import flows, and then substitute export flows when imports were small or missing. And we also adjust trade flows to 0 if they were less than 1,000. And just to take a really quick look at the raw data. So this is just the raw data, but it already suggests the story that we would like to emphasize, namely that the countries that we classify as retaliators or protesters did significantly reduce their imports from the US, so that US exports to these countries fall quite substantially, and we do not see a corresponding effect for US exports to countries that didn't respond. And the second thing that this graph illustrates is that really the majority of US export destination countries does respond in some form, right? So the majority of countries that trade with the US at the time are responding. So we use a gravity model to assess how these trade flows were influenced by the trade war. We use time-varying pair-specific indicator variables to measure who retaliates in response to the US. And that sort of lets us isolate the effects of the trade war. So US country X observations take the value of 1 in the quarter that a country implements a retaliatory tariff, and then it stays on in the months thereafter. And the gravity model lets us include exporter time, importer time, and pair fixed effects to control for a long list of potential confounders that are country specific or global. So either individual policy responses or the general depression. And that implies that the estimated effects sort of measure these changes over time in bilateral imports for a given set of countries. And just to reiterate again, this is sort of what separates our work from previous research that has examined interwar trade flows and that has focused sort of more on protectionism and the rise in tariffs more generally. So the dependent variable that we look at is a log of a country J's imports from country I, and then we test for the effect of retaliator, threatener, or responder, sort of defined, as I mentioned earlier, on these import flows. So they turn on when a country either retaliates or responds, and then we bring in a variety of controls. So Sterling bloc, imperial preference, the Anglo-Irish trade war, the Reichsmark bloc, gold bloc, reciprocal trade agreements with the US, and a crisis dummy. So looking at the results, the first 2 columns here include the dummies for responders. So this is retaliator and protester combined. And then column 3 sort of breaks it out into retaliator and threatener. So again, threateners are the countries that do file protests with the US State Department, but don't actually follow through and increase tariffs. What you see here is that the coefficient on responder is negative and statistically significant, showing that US exports to these responding countries were on average 18 to 25% lower. And for retaliation, we see an effect of about 28 to 33%, while protesting reduced US exports by 15 to 22%. So these results are robust to a number of robustness checks. So we restricted the sample to sovereign countries, thinking that these are the countries that might have more authority over their trade policies, and it doesn't change the results. We also dropped individual retaliator countries from the sample to make sure that not any one country is actually driving those results. These results are also robust to a grouping of the retaliators. So if we break out the retaliators into the imperial preference countries, which are Canada and Australia, the gold bloc countries, France, Italy, and Switzerland, and then the rest, which would be Argentina, Cuba, Mexico, and Spain, then for all three groups, we see negative and significant effects, and we find the largest effect for the imperial preference countries, and that is consistent with some other work that Kevin O'Rourke has done on this. In the next section, then, we ask a question of whether countries are responding strategically. So targeting another country's products in a trade war is often done with strategic intentions. So in 2017-18, for example, China retaliated against US tariffs by raising duties on key products that were produced in states that were considered critical for the election, right? So in a trade war, we think that we should see these differential effects both at the country level, but also at the product level. And this is especially important for the 1930s, since overt discrimination using tariffs was actually difficult. So a lot of these countries had most favored nation agreements and were sort of bound by those. What's the alternative then? Rather than increasing tariff on a specific country, you would raise tariffs or put up non-tariff barriers on specific goods, and you would try to disproportionately target key US exports with your selection of these product categories. And narrative evidence suggests that these key US exports were actually targeted. So there's a lot of evidence around targeting of autos, for example, right? So Czechoslovakia, for example, implements auto quotas that bind. France changes auto tariffs from value to weight, recognizing that the American cars tend to be much heavier than the European counterparts. And so by making that change, the American cars would be mostly affected by this tariff adjustment. So to get at this response at the product level, we construct a new panel data set consisting of about 28,000 observations for 104 product categories that are exported from the US to 59 trade partners, right? So these are just US export data reported by the US Department of Commerce. The sample period here includes 1926 through 1932. And then we identify the top 10 exports from the US to each country or colony in our data set, right? So that gives us a measure of sort of the key products that countries were importing from the US. And based on these historical accounts, reading through the literature, we recognize this focus on autos. And so we also look at autos as a separate category. What makes autos interesting here? So these American-made automobiles were really fast growing and important US export categories, but they also receive a lot of attention because they're a differentiated product that was very easily identifiable in its final form, right? So Chrysler, Ford, General Motors were these highly visible American brands that were easily recognized. Moreover, they were consumer products rather than producer goods, so restricting their supply did not risk hurting domestic industries. So using this product level data, we again run a gravity model now focusing on US exports. The dependent variable is US exports of good K to country J in period T. Top 10 is a dummy variable that indicates whether in 1928, the good was among the top 10 US exports to this country. And then we again include retaliator, responder, threatener dummies, just as they were classified earlier. And then we include product time, country time, and product country fixed effects. So the result here is that the identifying variation in US exports is sort of at the product trade partner time level. We find that the most important US exports to countries that did respond to Smoot-Hawley were actually disproportionately affected. So on average, the chief US exports to retaliators fell by an additional 33% for the retaliators, and then by an additional 20% for the threateners. And if we aggregate this, putting those groups together into the responder group, we find an effect of about 22.5%. And if we take a look at auto products specifically, so if we signal out automobile exports by adding sort of a triple interaction term, we see that retaliators actually reduce their automobile imports from the US by an additional 46%. And this is also statistically significant for the threatener and responder dummies. In the last section of the paper, then, we measure welfare effects of the trade war on all participants. So the idea here is that the effect of the trade war on welfare might be ambiguous. So on the one hand, tariffs raise revenue, protect domestic industries, raising the price of foreign goods, and that should be welfare enhancing. On the other hand, welfare gains due to beggar thy neighbor effects would have presumably been diminished or eliminated by the retaliation. So we follow Arkolakos, Costinho, and Rodriguez-Clare, as well as Felbermeyer, Young, and Lodge, and estimate welfare as a function of the domestic trade share and the elasticity of trade, taking tariffs into account. So we measure gains from trade in country J, given this formula, where we use the trade elasticity of demand. We set that to 8 following Jacks and L in 2011. And lambda is the domestic expenditure share that we compute as 1 minus the import penetration ratio, and mu is a tariff multiplier. So that gives us a relatively easy access to measure the overall welfare effects. Since this equation measures the welfare changes relative to autarky, we can sort of use it to calculate the welfare changes, or we use it to calculate the welfare gains in 1929, 1930, and 1931 separately, and then we difference between those periods to find the overall effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. What we see is that for retaliators, welfare declined by 0.3 percentage points between 1929 and 1930, corresponding to a reduction of 8% in the total welfare gains from trade. And between 1929 and 1931, welfare declined by roughly 0.5 percentage points, or 16% of the total welfare gains from trade. And for threateners, the welfare effects are small but positive, while for the US, they're even smaller and are of mixed signs. So we interpret this in that the tariff in 1930 that provoked the trade wars was substantial and was broad-based, but was probably not an optimal tariff, even for a large economy like the US. And the significant retaliatory response that the US sees from these trade partners and that it provoked probably largely negated any welfare gains based on our calculations through 1931. And this is a finding that's actually consistent with what others have found, mostly Irwin in 2011. Retaliating countries suffered welfare losses, perhaps because they did not sort of impose optimal tariffs. They imposed retaliatory tariffs targeting these key US products. And that's probably what implemented or what generated the largest welfare losses for that group. Whereas for the threateners, some of which might have reported to non-tariff barriers, but we don't see any welfare losses. To conclude, here again, this is sort of the summary of the welfare effects table. And as you can see, we do find these negative welfare gains for the retaliators, whereas the threateners actually see a slightly positive effect. And for the US, we find mixed results. To conclude, and I see I'm early in time, but that leaves us more time for a discussion. So to conclude, let me just summarize again. We do find that historical accounts show that countries both threatened to retaliate and then actually retaliated in response to the Smoot-Hawley tariff. by focusing on the imports of strategic responders and sort of isolating these bilateral effects, we can identify the effects of the trade war. We do see that retaliation actually reduced US exports by about a third, depending on the specification. And in addition to the countries that retaliated with tariffs, narrative evidence does suggest the use of non-tariff barriers and quotas. So we're seeing these effects not just on countries that actually imposed retaliatory tariff, but also on countries that threatened to respond to Smoot-Hawley. And the retaliators and the protesters appear to have been strategic in that they did target key US imports. So top 10 imports to responders fell disproportionately, and especially American automobile imports by these countries were affected and appear to have been signaled out, falling by an additional 46%. On the welfare analysis, conventional measures of welfare gains to trade are small in general, and our results are consistent with that. But we do find this reduced welfare from trade for the retaliators if we measure the effects through the end of 1931. Where does this leave us for today? So we would argue that this is a cautionary tale for the kind of narratives to win a trade war, and that the lesson to be learned for current policy is that even though Peter Navarro didn't predict it, retaliation is actually taking place, and it does significantly reduce trade, and it is costly in terms of welfare. So let me stop here. Thank you very much. And yeah, lots of time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, and congratulations on this nice paper. We have one question from Leo Charles in the chat, which I guess you can read while I'll unmute him and he can ask it himself. So it seems he and we are muting and unmuting.
Yeah.
So Leo, now
can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wonder, as I wrote in the chat, can we estimate the trade gains for countries that have resisted the US? I think about Switzerland, for example. If they gain influence in bilateral trade with the US or with other countries. And I wrote that, in other words, have countries gain influence in the international arena through this tariff war with US? Do you have some element on this?
I'm thinking of an answer, but just to clarify, what do you mean by influence? Like they see increased trade, or they see any other kind of gains?
Yeah, about increasing in trade.
Okay. So I think that's a really interesting question, right? So what happens when we see this bilateral trade reduction for some trade pairs, and where does this go? And for some countries, we can actually identify this. So Kevin O'Rourke with co-authors, for example, had looked at the sort of British Empire group, and we see a clear intensification of trade for that group of countries. And we can see this for some countries in our example. So when we look at Canada, for example, you can see that the reduction in trade with the US is pretty much transferred to Great Britain, right? So we see a decline in trade with the US, and then we see an increase in trade with Britain. This is not as clear, not as obvious for all the countries, right? And it sort of goes beyond the scope of this paper to sort of identify this for all countries. So for some countries, it's very clear, and it sort of stood out to us. For Switzerland, I think it's a little bit less clear also because overall trade is rather small, so it's a little harder to isolate that. But that would, of course, be something that we could look at even more and that we could expand on even further.
Thank you very much.
So while the rest of the audience is thinking about their questions, maybe a short follow-up. because with this, and then I give the word to Chris Meissner, sort of this importance in US trade, actually, have you looked at sort of the follow-up reaction? So where, for example, countries who protested or actually retaliated more likely to conclude trade agreements under the RTAA that starts in sort of 1934 to undo these sorts of things. Have you looked at these sorts of things? So whether actually the US reacted to the reaction, or whether the US actually punished these by ignoring them?
That is actually a great question. We have not looked at this, but that is actually a great thing to move into, because we have the information on the RTAA and we have those coded, but we have not actually made that connection. So I can't answer that question now. If any of my co-authors have sort of a hunch about this and wants to chime in, they're welcome to. But we have not looked at this, but I'll take this down. This is actually a great suggestion.
So I also see that Michael Huberman had his hand up for a while. So Michael, if you want to ask a question, maybe you can just write, I have a question into the chat, and I can unmute you. It's now the turn for Chris Meissner, and he's asking in what sense Smoot-Hawley started as a trade war, and I guess Chris can.
Hey, Kirsten, and other co-authors who may or may not be around. This is a fabulous take on a pretty important period. I have lots of questions, and I'm looking forward to discussing in Tucson in a month or so. But one question I had is the motivation for Smoot-Hawley as a trade war. I mean, it's pretty obvious that people countries got angry or upset about some of these tariffs. After all, there was a world depression going on. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the motivations for American tariff lines. And I don't remember seeing the Smoot-Hawley start as a outright declaration of war on trade partners, because it was almost business as usual in the US just to pass tariffs, and maybe they were responding to some persistent problems in the 20s or the ongoing downturn in the economy. But it's a little bit different than Peter Navarro's trade war on China, where there's this huge imbalance and they say, wow, we're going to take China down. And I don't think anybody said that in 1929 or 1930, did they? But I don't know. So thanks a lot.
So thank you so much for your comment. So I would say yes and no. So I think to some degree you're right. There wasn't this specific focus on specific countries, right? This sort of antagony between the US and China, that was clearly part of the narrative in 2017-18. That's not what we see when we look at Smoot-Hawley. But if we look at where Smoot-Hawley comes from, and I think it's always important to remind sort of non-economic historians that it's a policy that clearly predates the Great Depression. House deliberations begin in January 1929, right after the election, right? And Hoover ran the election on the platform of wanting to raise tariffs, mostly wanting to raise tariffs on agriculture, right? And where does that impulse comes from? That really goes back to, as you already alluded, and as you know, to the early 1920s, right? So from the revisions in the tariff schedule in the US in the early 1920s, the US was sort of left with higher tariffs on manufactured goods, and there was this sense of agricultural producers sort of lobbying for tariffs, wanting to catch up, wanting more protection. And in that context, there is this sort of concern about fairness, right? So if you read the literature at the time, you do read comments around, this is sort of an unfair treatment. American agricultural producers are sort of taken advantage of in the global market. So that's sort of what we meant to allude to with this concern about fairness, right? There is this question around protection. What we then actually see and what we see manifesting as Smoot-Hawley is deliberated and then moves through the House and is eventually passed, is that we see this sort of much broader change in this tariff schedule than what was originally extended, right? So it goes well beyond agricultural tariffs that were initially negotiated, and we see this sort of very broad, to some degree, sort of very hodgepodge assembly of these very differentiated tariffs on a large set, like I mentioned, 890 different product categories.
Yeah, I mean, can I just say, I mean, in a way, you know, they say you always write history for the period you're writing in. So maybe the title Trade War, I mean, maybe it did come from the period that we were living through when we were writing it. And it's going through journals now, and of course, Trump is history, and the Trumpian motivation is being toned down now, maybe correspondingly. So, you know, I mean, if we called it the effects of the retaliation to Smoot-Hawley, that would have been 100% accurate, you know, and that is kind of what we do, you know, and but boy, the effects are really big, you know. It's really striking, you know, because you're controlling for, you have importer time fix effects in there, right? So you're controlling for the general decline in these countries' imports, and over and beyond that, you know, their imports from the US are falling by an additional 30% or whatever. It's huge, I think, actually, surprisingly big. I think we were surprised that it was that big anyway.
Yeah, and very robust.
While we are gathering further questions, I found this story of Cuba being a retaliator a bit, well, intriguing, because what we know about Cuba in this period is that the relationship and the dependency on the US is pretty strong. Do you know anything about the substance of these retaliations and where it comes from?
Let me just. So Cuba is the country that was hardest to sort of find information on, but they do increase tariffs on certain product categories in 1930, and they're being mentioned in sort of all the primary source materials that we could find. I don't have the exact product categories.
I have them here.
You have them? Great.
The appendix. So there were goods that had been imported in substantial quantities from the United States, largely agricultural, so livestock, fresh meat, dairy products, egg, fish, canned meat, unbleached cotton fabrics, cotton knit goods, onions and garlic. Now, yeah, so that was the basis on which that determination was made. Maybe this is actually a point where one could make a historiographical point to the people who don't know the historiography, which is when you read that, there is the question of, is it retaliation, you know? And people who've read Barry Eichengreen know that he's a little bit suspicious, you know, is it really retaliation? Can you tell, you know, maybe you're protecting cars. It's a pretty good thing to do if you're trying to hurt America, but maybe you wanted to protect cars anyway, you know? So you can read this two ways. You can read it one way as we've looked at the coding based on what contemporaries thought. We're taking that as given, and we're saying, gosh, this had a big effect. You know, or you could actually think of it the other way around, is that we're not really sure whether this coding is right or wrong, because how can you tell intention? You know, was the intention really to retaliate? But then the proof is in the trade data. And it looks like the contemporaries were right, you know, because it looks like American exports really are being relatively badly hit. So that's just, you know, so yeah, there's two ways to think about what it is that we're showing.
And just to sort of emphasize this, so the results that we find do not depend on sort of any specific retaliating country or any specific group of countries. So we do find this, and this is very persistent. We also were very conservative when we classified our retaliators, right? So we really only classified countries as retaliators if they're imposing a tariff, and we could find a reference to that tariff in 1930, right? So countries that are raising tariffs later, and there's a large group of countries that is changing tariffs in 1931 and later, we do not classify those as retaliators, right? Because there are clearly other things going on that might have then provoke that kind of policy response, right? So we're really looking at countries that are sort of immediately, and typically there's language around that being a response to the US and the US trade policy.
And I guess maybe the final point to make about these classifications is that protesters, like retaliators, there's elements of judgment involved. Yeah. Is a retaliator or not? You know, there are judgment calls to be made there. Protesters, it's subjective. Yeah. They're just there on the record. And one of the things that's very striking is that protesters are significantly differentially reducing their imports from the US, even if, you know, they weren't, you know, mentioned by the League of Nations as having retaliated, you know, suggesting that maybe countries were finding ways of getting their own back at America, you know, even if, you know, they're not being listed as deliberately raising tariffs on US goods, you know, so that de facto retaliation was broader than, it was much wider in scope than what even contemporaries thought, which I think is interesting as well. Yeah. They managed to really piss off a lot of people, the Americans, it looks like.
Yes. So.
Can I barge in, Marcus?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, Kevin. I read this paper twice, once in a previous incarnation and now, and I need something needs to be clarified, at least to me and maybe others in the audience. So in your regression, when you code retaliator, does that take it's effective only in the bilateral relationship with the US, or you have a dummy for retaliator and that affects bilateral trade, even not with the US, as a sort of a separate dummy? It could be, if you're thinking about a trade war and trade war situation, you might be looking at these ripple effects. So if a country is retaliating versus the United States, they might be retaliating against somebody else, or groups of countries or whatever once they start retaliating. So this is not clear from the specification. At least I reread the page a few times and the footnotes, but I couldn't figure it out. So if you can help me with that, clarify that.
It's with respect to the US. So it's coded with respect to the US. So we're really just picking up that US trade.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it would be nice if you can just put a dummy for retaliators in general, see if this is significant vis-a-vis their relationships in gravity equations with other countries. I mean, that would be. Well,
that would. I mean, in a sense, you're controlling, because you've got importer time fixed effects. You're controlling for their general trade policies. You know, so anyway, so you're controlling for their general level of protectionism. I mean, in some cases, like the British Empire retaliators, we've got British Empire dummies and things like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also if you coded it more broadly, then you might have also these adverse effects, right? Might be some trade reallocation taking place, and then you might not, you're not able to sort of separate that out.
I mean, I agree. I mean, it's just and so you're doing the welfare implications of the United States, but there's some other general welfare implications could be affected by this. I don't know. I mean, it's just
yeah. But these should be captured by the importer time, exporter time fixed effects.
I mean, there's maybe one other point to make about that. We're coding them as dummies, you know, and you know, it would be nicer, of course, if you had, you know, the tariff rates that you could put directly into the gravity equation or something, you know, and have all of those kind of bilateral trade costs. I mean, we don't have that. I mean, how are you going to get that for this period, you know? But I mean, on the other hand, I mean, and this is making virtue out of a necessity, but I mean, the interwar period is famous for the fact that it isn't just tariffs, there's quotas and there's lots of very difficult to measure stuff. And so the idea was, you know, that's why we have the quarterly frequency data, you know. So the hope was that with the quarterly frequency, you can use the time, you can use that to nail the effect of things down more by looking at the timing. So that was kind of the motive behind that data collection exercise. And unfortunately, we had to move to quarterly to get more countries in. We have it monthly for some countries, but then to get to 99 countries, we had to collapse it to quarterly. But for some of these countries, we have it monthly. So yeah.
But what it does let us do, and I think that's right of Kevin to sort of highlight the frequency, it does let us sort of see these differential effects, and we can immediately look for that effect in 1930, right? Which you don't see in the annual data. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Following up somewhat on this and what might be behind the retaliation, because it might not just be trade policy. We have a question by Gary Richardson on exchange rates and going on and off the gold standard as maybe a strategic response to these sorts of things. I give you the permission to speak.
Thanks. Yeah, just a summary of my questions. I mean, I didn't understand how you're controlling for this. So, and it's probably my problem. But I'm wondering if how you're controlling for the fact that one way the countries could be responding to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and the trade flows that they're inducing or shrinking is by going off gold, right? And then you have this differential change in exchange rates between the US and the other countries which stay on gold, and say the countries in the British bloc which are going off gold. And so it seems to me that, you know, that may be a joint decision to you know, use your exchange rates in some way to compensate for the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And that when you think about the analogy to Trump and Peter Navarro, right, that very explicitly people have accused China of retaliating against the Trumpian tariffs by using exchange rates, right, and monetary policy, which, you know, could be happening in the 1930s. So I didn't understand how you're controlling for that.
Yeah, so this is something we actually thought long and hard about, because people have made that argument for the interwar period as well, right? Mean, for example. So I'm going to punt to the fixed effects here, right? Because if we have importer time, exporter time, and the pair fixed effects, they should be capturing those changes. Where it does make a difference maybe is countries that devalue early, right? So Argentina, for example, goes off gold very early, and you might think that that is something that is confounding those effects. So we run a version of a robustness check that excludes Argentina, so we're not finding that that's driving the result, right? So that sort of reassured us there.
But we did also directly include exchange rates in one iteration, just as a control variable. And the problem was that for reasons that I can't remember, I guess we couldn't find exchange rates for all of our countries. And so then the country sample size halved or something like that. Mm-hmm. But and so that's why that's not the baseline specification. But when you include exchange rates, you still get the results. And in that reduced sample, if you have the exchange rates in as a control, or if you don't have the exchange rates, if you have them in or if you don't have them in, the key coefficients don't move at all.
Correct.
You know, if for that reduced sample, they're a little bit different than for the full sample, but you know, in the reduced sample, you know, it doesn't matter. I mean, basically the coefficients are invariant to the inclusion of that. So I think we're fairly confident there.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So may I barge in?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions about size and distribution, right? So if I know that you're downplaying the Trump analogy for obvious reasons, but one of the key elements in the tweets was that we're big, right? And so this is going to dissuade. There'll be some retaliation, but it won't bite that much because nobody can afford not to trade with us. So how did you think about this, right? So your table 9 clearly shows that there was an equal distribution of losses, right? And the US, starting with the fact that it wasn't a terribly open economy, right? Was always going to lose less from this. And then the other thing is that everyone was trying to dissect the distributional and geographic effects of the Trump trade wars onto the US economy. Can you do something similar? Can you use census data? Can you see where these things were hit more? So you have you have your estimates, you go down to the product level. So maybe you could transform this into some kind of heat map of losses. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rui. I haven't thought about your second comment, but I'll take that down. That's definitely something to maybe consider further. And on the size, I mean, I think to some extent that does correspond to the kind of welfare effects that we're seeing, right? And I don't want to sort of overstate those welfare results, but I think they're sort of consistent with that idea that essentially it's the retaliators that are probably being harmed the most in this exercise.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't emphasize the welfare results that much. You know, we put them in as a referee or a commenter wanted us to put them in at one point, so we put them in, you know. I mean, there are issues with welfare effects, for example, assuming full employment trade models in the middle of the Great Depression, you know, that's, you know, that type of thing, you know, but but so, yeah, they are what they are. Yeah.
But I think they're consistent with that. I mean, if you look at the modern methodologies, they don't find much larger effects either. And I think they do get at this question, right, that, you know, we don't see a positive effect for the US, and we do find this negative effect for the retaliators.
Right, but even a small average effect may be very unequally distributed across industries and regions and so on. And of course, there's such an interesting political economy story around this, right? That it might be you know, an interesting thing to do. Hence my second comment.
I'll take that down. It's duly noted. I'll take that down for further consideration. But we haven't disaggregated this at this level, or connected it to the sort of geographical design.
If I may, Chair, so piggyback on Nathan's point, maybe a different way of asking this question is, you know, whether there would be any supply chain effects, right? So if you're thinking of capital goods, tariffs on capital goods, these will affect production costs elsewhere, might then have a ripple effect through imports to the US. So in any of your, I'm sure, many iterations, consider this.
Yeah, we did not at this point, but yeah, you're right. I mean, these effects could take place and probably did take place.
Yeah, because
it's so cool if we had a global input-output table for the 1930s, you know, the way that we have now. Imagine all the things you could do, you know, and you know, the people who've been frustrated with the existing geometric research that suggests small effects of protection in the 30s. I think the instinct has always been that if you could disaggregate and take account of interactions and so on at the global level, you know, you might find ways of bumping up results, you know, like aren't there these macro papers where you have, you know, particular sectors, you know, when you look at the sectoral things, then, you know, some sectors can cause the whole thing to blow up and so on. But I don't think we have the data really. We have IO tables for some individual countries. Yep. Not, you know, and by the way, that's another thing that occurs to me is that when we're going to do welfare, you know, slightly more rigorously, I mean, that would be a useful, you know, then you would maybe get into, yeah, you'd be looking at doing gravity models with domestic flows, and then you'd need the IO tables then to kind of convert value added into gross flows. And, you know, but we have a couple of IO tables. So I mean, actually, that's something I'm interested in feedback on. You know, we have one for Britain, I think we have one, you know, we probably have a couple for the interwar period. If you were willing to be heroic and kind of extrapolate, then one could try to do that kind of thing. And then one could do a kind of Hedmeyer style, more GE style welfare calculation. And one could do it for other trade wars too. It might be worth doing.
Yeah, but I think it goes beyond the scope of it.
It's certainly beyond the scope.
No, absolutely. I
think actually, got nearly all the data. Yeah.
So Rui basically took my final question out of my mouth. I was more asking about the differential losers outside the US and how much of redistribution might be going on there and so on. But I guess we can continue this in the more informal part of this session, which is the further 15 minutes which we have. I now conclude the official part and just announce that next week there is a seminar on the Columbian Exchange and Conflict in Asia by Martin Cheko, James Fensky, and Anil Menon. I hope we are going to see you all there. So I think now we stay silent for 30 seconds and
thank you very much.
Thank everybody for attending.
I guess we don't need to share the slides anymore, do we? We can see each other then better.
Right.
So if anybody in the audience, and of course especially younger researchers, has questions to the present authors, please just raise your hand. I can just unmute you so you can
Are
talk.
they able to kind of join the main square so we can see their faces, or they're still?
No, we can't do that because this is a webinar. It's a different setting. Yeah, we can't do that.
Michael Huberman has a question about the intensive and extensive margin. Michael, I'm just going to unmute you or give you the permission to do this yourself.
All right.
There you are.
How's that?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Enjoyed the paper. Much of economic history of international trade now is kind of couched in terms of intensive, extensive margins. Marcus and Kevin have written on that. And I was surprised I didn't hear those terms in your presentation. As I understand it, the dependent variable in the regressions is really the intensive margin. Is that right?
But it's total. I mean, it's total trade. In the main regressions, it's total trade.
Yeah, which is a kind of like proxy people use for the intensive margin. I was surprised you didn't you don't talk about goods. I mean, were any goods exiting in this period that stopped trading altogether as a result of Smoot-Hawley?
With our product level data set, we could do that. Actually, that was a logical thing that we could have done.
It's a very interesting thing because trade policy is going to be working. It's going to work through the intensive side, of course, but you really, I mean, we are also interested in the relationship between trade policy and extensive margin. I mean, and that's an important part of the 1930 story, I think.
So Marcus and me, we haven't been finding a lot of action on the extensive margin for looking at trade collapses in a bunch of Asian countries and in Britain. Those are import collapses, but, you know, and I suppose if income is falling, you don't necessarily, and if there's big sunk costs or whatever in terms of relationships, you don't necessarily just get out of a market. But maybe if you're talking about a hostile trade environment or something, and people are actually trying to hurt America, you know, maybe this is a good place where you might find extensive action, possibly. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I just working on the Spanish case. And they were a retaliator. I mean, the car market just drops out completely. I mean, it's a good that exits in this period. So I guess if you go into the country by country cases, you would see some little more action on the extensive side.
I think that would be interesting to look at, actually.
Yeah, we haven't done this, but on the product level, we could. And there were none that sort of jumped out, but we also didn't sort of look at it with that question in mind. So, yeah.
It is certainly an important question because these are sort of the trade relations which you potentially kill for a much longer time because they're not just reduced, but really you lose the trade representatives, the networks and all these sorts of things, and that might be more difficult to rebuild. Of course, in the case of Spain, it's difficult to see the medium to long run because the civil war is coming in.
Yeah, I'll take that down as a to-do.
In general, this whole imperial thing, how did you manage to or what is your hunch about, did colonies do something on their own or actually metropolis sort of protesting for their colonies as well? Did you try this? I mean, you took out the colonies from your data set somehow, but I guess if especially the British colonies, for example, where the trade policy, not the dominions, where the trade policy is made in London, if they were doing something, I guess they were doing it for everybody. But then, of course, Britain is not really making much differential trade policy. I don't know. What did you find?
So what is very clear, and I think this is good news for you guys. So these sort of empire effects that you identified, they're very clear and very persistent, right? So no matter how we sort of slice the data and what subset we look at, this is what stands out, and the retaliatory response stands out, right? These are the two things. We looked at sort of the full set and then sovereigns only to try to get at this. We do know that, I mean, there are some differential effects in terms of trade policy. So what Britain does is not necessarily what everybody does. I had some examples here. Where is it? Hang on. So British East Indies, British West Indies actually impose their own trade policy. Not finding it right now. So there are some differential effect that we're sort of capturing then when we look at just the set of sovereign countries or the full set, but it doesn't change the results, right? So it's robust to this.
I guess that the non-sovereign responders, they're all protesters, are they, rather than threateners? Yeah. Is that right? Yeah,
no, so protester.
Yeah, they're protesters. Yeah.
Mm.
Without wanting to turn this into a conversation between just the three of us, do you know anything about other ways of retaliating? Like, I don't know, threatening not to pay back debts to America, or kicking out banks from your country, American bankers, or any other sort of a thing that might hurt, which might indirectly affect trade, maybe, but which just shows that countries are annoyed about this.
I didn't come across anything. I don't know if Kevin did. What sort of really stands out, if you read the literature and you look at things, are sort of the boycotts, right? They are sort of very public. They get discussed in the newspapers. Like American automakers take out these full-page ads in American newspapers saying that, you know, real Italians don't drive American cars and stuff. So that really stands out. I haven't come across any sort of other, especially on the financial side. But I don't know, Kevin, do you know?
I'm willing to bet, but based on no information, just based on a priori logic, that if you look at speeches of ministers of finance in Latin America when they are about to default on their debts, that they say, you know, how do you expect us to pay back our debts when you're putting tariffs up on you? And I bet you they are framing it in retaliatory terms. But, you know, this is like, then you have the Barry question of when is retaliation coming in spades, because, you know, it might just be rhetoric, right? I'm willing to bet that there are people who said that. Yeah.
But then I think it's also how the countries are sort of framing that response, right? Because some of them are saying, we're going to do this, but it's not retaliation, right? Because they don't want to be seen as retaliating, but they are effectively retaliating, right? So then, you know, I think if you look at these responses, sometimes it's hard to sort of tease out.
There is a question from Thilo Albers, who I think can...
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for the talk. I lost track of time and was a bit late, which is why I have two more specific or more generous questions, actually. And the first one is on the welfare effect. So, this is not about your calculation per se, but I was wondering, like, what magnitudes you would consider plausible, because like if you use this ACR formula or a version thereof, I always feel like you get very, very small effects, like relative to what you would expect for, say, small open economies. And then the second point I wanted to make, more like on the framing of but that was retaliation or not. So from my reading of the economists of that time and the Guardian, I feel like people were pretty open about retaliation, actually, the finance ministers and so on, and the trade ministers, and so I think it's very plausible that you find it and frame it that way.
Yeah, so on the welfare effects, I think you're right? Overall effects are small. We're seeing them being small. They're small in that kind of literature, right? So what we're finding is quite consistent with what others are finding. And yeah, I mean, we agree on the retaliation, right? We think it's there, and to some degree it is there in the contemporary literature, but like I just mentioned, right, to some degree it's also like, you know, some countries don't want to use that word, right? Or in some contexts they don't want to use that word. So
can I just point out that, I mean, one of Barry's very first papers was pointing out that in a Keynesian world with Keynesian unemployment and depression and so on, actually a little bit of protection that put a floor under prices and helped turn around expectations of deflation and so on might be just what the doctor ordered from a short-run business cycle point of view, you know. And Clemens and Williamson find that the tariff growth correlation turns positive in the interwar period. So, you know, I think, you know, one could do these exercises, but it's a very different environment, you know. I mean, so the welfare effects might actually have been positive in some countries. You know, you don't. I mean, I'm open-minded about that myself. And then the question, then the story that you would tell is that in many countries, then unfortunately, when you get out the other side of World War II in the 1940s and 50s, they don't always lower the tariffs when they're now no longer helpful but harmful. That's certainly the story in Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I can just recur in that, I think there's a lot to Barry's and also like Irvin's story of the general rise of protectionism. But I mean, actually Barry was my examiner for my PhD, and I think I could convince him at least a little bit that this bilateral level mattered a lot. And so I look more at the case of France, right? In looking at the response of currency devaluations, but I think it's the case is I think the case is pretty clear for that actually, and yeah, so I buy that 100%, and I still would like to press you on this, like how much would you think is a plausible welfare effect in terms of GDP compared to what you actually measure?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that when people do the kind of the GE welfare calculations, they get slightly bigger numbers. I mean, a proper trade person can correct me here. I see a couple of them in the audience. You know, I mean, this paper by Cherry Meyer and co-authors on the effects of Brexit or whatever, and you know, they kind of get slightly bigger effects. You know, they get 4 or 5% welfare effects, something like this. But who knows? You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also, it happens within the context of all these other events of 1930, 1931, right? So I think that sort of makes it hard to isolate that. But
yeah, I mean, I think just the size of the trade effects is interesting. You know, I think you know, without speculating about what the welfare effects are, it's going to be model based necessarily. And we can argue what model you should use for this period. I mean, the gravity model gives you trade effects, and the trade effects are really big. I mean, I think they're unambiguously really big. So I think that's the kind of the key point of the paper, really. I think, you know, and it fits in with sort of this general view that, I mean, if you start looking more carefully at the impact of protectionism on the interwar period, I mean, the claim was not only that protection had no effect on GDP. You know, it either had a small negative effect or a small positive effect if you were Barry, you know, but it was basically tiny, you know, but then the literature also said it, you know, protection didn't even have any effect on trade flows. And I think that's, I mean, I think when you start looking at it, either looking at disaggregated trade flows or here, you know, using higher frequency data, you know, which enables you to then look at the impact of kind of policy measures that, you know, aren't just tariffs, but there's quotas and all sorts of other stuff, you know, then you are getting big effects on trade flows, on bilateral trade flows, on the pattern of trade, you know. So I think that this paper kind of helps rehabilitate the notion that the protectionism was a big deal for trade patterns in the interwar period.
Yeah. I think we're at the end of this informal extension. Rui, Nathan, do we have any
Exactly
announcements?
right. Yeah, I think we should call it a day, and thank our speakers again. And it was a great discussion. And as you mentioned already, we'll see each other virtually next week.
Thank you so much. This was very helpful. I think we have 2 more papers to write now. But,
All right, great. Increasing returns technology. Great. Look at that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.